You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Clio Digital Media, and support for this episode comes from the Massachusetts Historical Society, the first historical society founded in the United States in 1791. Hello, and welcome to Ben Franklin's World Revisited, a series of classic episodes that bring fresh perspective to our latest episodes and add deeper connections to our understanding of early American history. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. Next week, we're going to investigate the everyday experiences of soldiers who fought in the War for American Independence. So soldiers who served in the British Army, Continental Army, and in militia units. And our investigation in episode 442 will include what they ate, how they trained, what they endured, and what kept them in the field. But before we actually embark on that investigation, I thought it was worth exploring the question of what it actually took to keep an 18th century army alive. Now, many of us carry a particular kind of image when it comes to Valley Forge. Ragged soldiers huddled together in snow-covered huts with little heat. Hungry men gnawing on whatever they could find, including old shoe leather. These are powerful images, but are they accurate images? In episode 348, we met with Ricardo Herrera, a military historian who is now a contributor to the George Washington Leadership Institute. He's also the author of Feeding Washington's Army, Surviving the Valley Forge Winter of 1778. Now, during our conversation, Rick reveals why Valley Forge was not just a place of frozen suffering, but a hub of military operations as a modern forward operating base. How the catastrophic failures of the Continental Army supply systems forced Washington to send armed foraging columns into the Pennsylvania countryside, seizing food, horses, and equipment from the very civilians the Army was supposed to be protecting. And the story behind the Grand Forage of February 1778, the largest military operation launched out of Valley Forge, which included more than 1,200 soldiers under Nathaniel Greene and Anthony Wayne. But first, a quick question for you. Do you ever share a fascinating historical fact with someone and get the look? You know the one I'm talking about. If that's you, I have the perfect place for you, the History Explorers Club. The History Explorers Club is a virtual community for curious adults who love to explore, discuss, and honestly just geek out about early American history. No scholarly background is needed, you just need to bring your curiosity. Inside the club, you'll get access to live historian talks, monthly community calls, a lively forum where everyone actually knows what they're talking about, and regular lunchtime chats with me every month. Membership starts at $33 per month, and you can cancel at any time. Visit historyexplorers.club to learn more and join us. That's historyexplorers.club. All right, I know the weather has started to turn warm again, even here in New England, but you may want to just bundle up for our adventure into Valley Forge in 1778. Are you ready? Let's go meet our guest historian. Joining us is a visiting professor in the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College. Before becoming a historian, our guest served as an armor and cavalry officer in the United States Army. He has spent most of his career as a historian who specializes in 18th and 19th century American military history, and he's written numerous articles and 2 books, including Feeding Washington's Army, Surviving the Valley Forge Winter of 1778. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Ricardo Herrera.
Hi, Liz. I'm very happy to enter it.
It's a fun place, this Ben Franklin's World, and we hope you enjoy your time in it. So, we're going to be talking about the United States' First Army and its memorable winter at Valley Forge in the winter of 1777 and 1778. Rick, what do we need to know about the Continental Army as a fighting force, and could you tell us a bit about the context of its creation?
The Continental Army, God, I want to call it something of a pickup team. What takes place is that following the initial hostilities in New England in April of 1775, the British garrison in Boston gets surrounded by New England militiamen. And the Continental Congress on the 14th of June, 1775, decides to adopt these fellows as the Continental Army. It's not terribly continental. It's mostly New England militiamen, although we will see the 1st Continental Regiment which is comprised primarily of riflemen from Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. And in fact, the colonel of that 1st Regiment is buried here in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. But they get adopted on the 14th of June, and that's the date that the U.S. Army celebrates as its birthday, making it the senior service in the United States. It gets adopted then, and the size of it fluctuates. We estimate that somewhere around 230,000 soldiers served in the Army from 1775 through 1784, when it was finally disbanded. At any one time, its largest size was maybe around 48,000 strong. And that's really in every theater, every department. So it's not in any one concentrated place. In fact, Washington's largest army that he commanded was during the New York campaign of 1776. And it's about 23,000 strong Continentals and militiamen. When he marches into Valley Forge, he's got about 10,000 soldiers. When they march out for Monmouth, something over 14,000 strong in May of 1778. But the Army, in many ways, was a microcosm of American society. It was decentralized in the sense that every state raised its own continental line, and these were based upon quotas assigned to the various states. So each state had its own organization, although they did serve under the aegis of this larger thing called the Continental Army. The first enlistments, in 1775 and then in 1776, they follow along the lines of something that Charles Royster has called the Raj Militaire. And so these are the guys who are patriotic. They're in there for it. It's excitement. It's a sense of duty. You name it. Every soldier's motives for enlisting then, just as they are today, are very particular to that soldier. So they fall into a variety of reasons. By the time we get to the Valley Forge encampment, we're actually looking at the 3rd Continental Army. And Washington has finally gotten Congress to agree to longer-term enlistments. 3 years. My God, that's great. Because previously, what are they getting? 1 year service. And that's really not a good deal for this thing that they're trying to create, the United States of America. So Washington gets this 3-year force. They were organized very much along the same lines as the British Army. So sort of an American take, if you will, as to how the Americans, particularly Washington, envisioned a regular army should look like. So primarily infantry, bolstered by artillery. They had 4 regiments of Continental Light Dragoons. And as part of the American Army's tradition through, frankly, the 19th century, most officers struggled to know what to do with the cavalry or how to use it properly. There was no real tradition of it. So it's very much this American-style version of the British Army, and it follows many of the same tactics, linear tactics, maneuvering by touch of elbow, trying to fire in volleys, you name it.
Did regional culture impact the culture of the Continental Army at all? You mentioned that at its start, the Continental Army was mostly made up of New Englanders, and then later we have the addition of riflemen from Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. And as men would come in and out of the Army, and you said there were about 230,000 soldiers who served throughout the American War for Independence, as men would come in and out of the Army, how did their regional cultures and origins impact the Army's culture? I'm thinking in particular of Washington's shock at how New Englanders elected their officers and how he thought they were just generally undisciplined.
And Washington's famous remark is that he finds them an exceeding dirty lot. And that's really not the tone that you should take with your soldiers. You may be the general, but you got to show them some respect. It's a two-way street, Your Excellency. But Washington and many of these soldiers, most of them had never traveled more than, say, 50 miles away from home. And so when they march across the length and breadth of the eastern seaboard, they're entering entirely new worlds. One of the things that, for example, Joseph Plum Martin, who's probably one of the best known enlisted men of the war because of his memoirs, Martin writes about Pennsylvanians as Southerners. He can't understand their accents. They can't understand his. And so the regional distinctions were incredibly pronounced. And they're trying to get a feel for one another, trying to understand one another. And it's really through their service that starts to create more of an identity as Americans. Not that that ever happens fully, because we do have, of course, that thing often called the late unpleasantness, the Civil War, which this dysfunctional republic goes to war with itself and helps create at least some form of American identity after 4 years of mutual slaughter. But the regional distinctions are incredibly varied, and those are preserved within the regiments. There are a handful of additional regiments, as they were termed, and they're probably the closest things that you will see to a continental regiment. And so they might have soldiers from 3, 4, 5 different states. So that's about the closest you're going to get to anything resembling a continental regiment in the truest sense.
That makes me wonder if men like Joseph Plum Martin, who I believe was from Connecticut, I wonder if Martin and other men took opportunities to visit and experience different regional camps as they were serving in the Army. Like, did someone like Martin say, I'm going to breakfast with the Pennsylvania camp and I'm going to try out their food. And then maybe for dinner, I'm going to go to Virginia and find out what their entertainment and food is like. Just as a different way of sampling different American cultures as they're all coming together behind this cause for independence.
One of the things that takes place, for example, at Valley Forge, what Washington does is disperse smaller elements to form a screen line to man security outposts and what have you. And these soldiers are going out on patrols and they're meeting new people. They're meeting different types of farmers, different types of crops and settlement patterns. So this is as much a war for the creation of an American republic as it is a war of, and this is unintentional, mind you, a war of self-discovery, a war of discovery of this country that they're trying to create.
So we have this highly regionalized Continental Army that is both a fighting force and a place of cultural exchange, a place where soldiers could discover what the United States that they're fighting for really is. Now, Rick, you mentioned earlier that at its largest, the Continental Army would be about 48,000 men strong, and that was during the New York campaign. What were the logistics in trying to supply this army? And who's even in charge of trying to supply this army? Was it the Second Continental Congress? Was it George Washington? Or was this something that was entirely left up to the states?
Supplying the Continental Army was the 8-year nightmare. Congress had set up a system, and it was done out of the best of intentions, but set up a system that was intended to try and prevent the growth of military power. And as they looked at this, here's the army. It's got brute strength in the form of soldiers armed. But you then look at the logistical piece, purchasing agents, commissaries, quartermasters. All of these men have got financial power. That's another form of growing military power, growing centralized power, and this scares the bejeebers out of Congress. So in order to try and prevent power, in order to check the growth of power, Congress sets up some complex rules governing the purchasing and distribution of supplies. Well-intentioned it was, but a disaster for most of the war. The times that the system did work, those tended to be the rarities. And that's really once you get Nathaniel Greene in office, and this is a post that he does not want to hold. As he complains, who's ever heard of a quartermaster general in history? He'll finally get his chance, though, following the debacle at Camden, and return to field duty. But to get back to the original question, trying to supply this army was a Herculean task. If you look at a soldier's rations, for example, every private is allotted 1 pound of beef or half a pound of pork, or 1 pound of saltfish per day, a pound of bread or flour daily, 3 pints of peas or beans per week, a pint of milk per day, and a quart of beer per day. And there are other pieces in there, candles, soap, and so forth. Very rarely did any soldier get that. And if you look at officers' rations, they get extra rations in part because they're expected to, in the case of senior officers, host off other officers for dinner, but also they've got servants to take care of. It's very rare that anybody receives his full rations. And in fact, quite often the rations are spoiled when they do arrive. So it's really a disastrous system. A big piece of it is due to the worthlessness of continental money. When we fast forward to near the end of the war, 1781, 225 paper dollars are worth $1 in continental specie. That's how worthless this stuff is. And farmers and others are just unwilling to accept this worthless money. And another problem in there is the fact that by 1778, Congress has changed the regulations, and now purchasing agents have got to post a $5,000 bond, and throughout the war, they have had to rely upon their own extensive networks of suppliers. And so they're literally venturing forth their own capital to try and feed the army. Then they turn in receipts, and then Congress has to examine the receipts. And when they get paid, well, that's anybody's guess.
Could you take us inside the logistical process of trying to supply the Continental Army with food? My understanding about supply is that even though Americans were new at having their own army that they had to supply, there were men out there like Philip Schuyler, who served in the British Army's quartermaster department during the 7 Years' War, who had some idea and some experience at supplying large armies. So how much of this previous supply experience from the British Army carried over and informed the supply of the American Army?
I'm glad you mentioned Schuyler and others like him. Most of the Americans who had had any experience on the quartermaster or commissary side of the house had not been doing it for large forces. And so they've got some introduction to it, but not a real proper grounding, as it were. And they do understand some of the basics. The big problem, though, is trying to go out and purchase these supplies. And as I'd noted earlier, the fact that continental dollars were nearly worthless and getting more worthless by the day in some cases, the purchasing agents were really challenged to try and get a hold of basics like food. And that's the easy stuff for Americans. This war is being waged in a land of plenty. As observers often noted, America was probably the best poor man's country in the world. But trying to get these supplies was a real challenge. Another piece was the transportation. Not enough wagons, not enough horses, not enough harnesses, not enough men willing to serve as teamsters to drive these wagons. Part of that's related to pay, part of that is related to militia duty, part of that is related to the fact that many of these men are farmers and they can't afford to be away from what is their real work, which is tending the family farm. So you've got a host of problems in that. When it comes to manufactured goods, Americans were manufacturing some firearms, but for the most part, they're getting captured stocks of British Brown Bess muskets. They're also getting imports of French Charleville muskets. They're getting captured powder. They're manufacturing their own powder. The same thing with shot. Same thing with cannon. They're trying to manufacture their own, but the industrial capacity of the United States, such as it was not terribly large. So they're doing better off by actually getting supplies from the French, from the Dutch, some that are captured, and various other sources. Much the same can be said for uniforms. Trying to uniform and shoe this army was another monumental task. And you see in Washington's letters the tremendous burden that he's got. You know, he's got officers who are manning the staff departments, and they're of varying quality. Some are quite good. Some you just wonder how they manage to get out of bed without hurting themselves. And Washington is often functioning as his own supply officer. And so he's writing letters to the governors of the states. Hey, send supplies. I need help. He'll send out officers from various continental regiments to their home states to try and talk to the politicians to get supplies for the army from them. So it's really a game of desperation, and they really do try their best to try and feed and clothe and arm and shoe this army. It's a struggle for the entirety of the war.
As a historian who has looked at these major logistical challenges and supply chains, if you were to grade the Continental Congress and the officers in the Army at supplying the Continental Army, what grade would you give them? How well did they succeed in their task to supply the Army?
Am I allowed to grade them on effort?
Sure. Why not? What about 2 grades? One for effort and one for accomplishment.
I'd have to give the officers, there are a few who just stand out for very poor performance, but by and large, for effort, I've got to give the Continental Commissariat and Quartermaster officers an A for effort. These guys really exert themselves. It's something else. In terms of their actual accomplishments, the reality, oh gosh, I'm going to be generous and say a C+. And that's due to circumstances that are frankly out of their hands. Congress's intentions, hallelujah. Thank you so much for your interest in virtue. But virtue doesn't feed empty bellies. Congress, you're getting a D. Your intentions are A+, but the reality is you're barely passing. And that's because of the fears and so much more.
Now, because of the issues it had with supply chains and the worthlessness of the continental dollar, the Army often just had to overcome its inadequate supply. So, Rick, how did the Continental Army face its supply challenges? Could you tell us about the impressment of goods, the foraging for goods, and other techniques and tactics the Army would have used to overcome its inadequate supply?
Foraging was a constant for the Continental Army. Now, I'm not going to say that they were following Maurice de Sax's injunction that it's better to live off of your enemy and spare your prince the expense of feeding the army, because these soldiers are campaigning in the country that they hope to create, the republic they hope to create. So they will go out, look for the supplies that they need. On a good operation, there'll generally be a purchasing agent accompanying the troops. This purchasing agent will keep records and issue IOUs to the farmers for the goods that are impressed. Do the farmers actually want to have anything impressed? Of course not. Nobody wants their property taken from them. And in fact, if you're lucky, your farm will never be anywhere near any soldiers, because everybody's army was a tremendous engine of destruction. Even if they were on your side, your fence rails are going to be gone. Your fruit trees, they're going to be picked clean. Your cattle, your ducks, your chickens, you name it, they will be gone because soldiers are hungry and they need to feed themselves. And unless they're kept a close eye on, everything's going to disappear. But the army was regularly foraging throughout its existence, no matter where it went. Now, there were times, as I said, that the supply system did work, and that lessened the need to forage. But for the most part, soldiers are going out and trying to get what they can. And that, while necessary to sustain the army, that really forces the army to reduce its combat strength, because instead of preparing to fight, or instead of actually going out and patrolling and looking for the enemy, trying to gather intelligence, you name it, soldiers are out trying to feed their fellow soldiers. Now, I should also add, though, that the British were doing the same thing. There's a rule of thumb for the British Army in this period that they needed 6 months of supplies on hand. That only happens once or twice throughout the entirety of the war. And so during the occupation of Philadelphia, General Howe's soldiers spend more of their time going out looking for food and firewood than they do searching for the enemy. So the need to supply and to sustain these armies really helps drive much of their actions on the battlefield. It helps limit some of their actions on the battlefield because of the necessities of taking care of soldiers.
How did the Continental Army define the act of foraging and the act of impressment? Because these are actions that we're going to continue to talk about.
Foraging is essentially sending out bodies of troops, and this varies. The British, for example, have to send out something like a brigade strength. So in other words, 2 or more battalions to forage. One to actually go out and look for food and supplies. That's the foraging piece. Another battalion serving as a covering force, because you can't go outside of Philadelphia very far and not risk getting attacked by American Continentals or militiamen. So they need a covering force to protect the foragers. So they're going out, and that's the actual act of gathering stuff. Impressment. Hello, Mr. Farmer, I'm knocking on your door. You seem to have X amount of supplies. I'd like to take X minus this amount of supplies from you. Here's a receipt. There's impressment. Now, depending on how things are going, sometimes the impressment may be uncompensated. And in fact, Nathaniel Greene encounters this in March of 1778 when he leads out his column from Valley Forge. He gets tired of farmers trying to sequester their goods, and previously he'd been pretty good about giving out receipts. Now he tells Washington, I hear their cries, but like Pharaoh, I harden my heart. And he decides that if you sequester your goods, my soldiers are going to seize them. You will get no receipts. So you're not only getting worthless continental dollars, you're getting nothing.
So when we're talking about foraging, we aren't always talking about the army going out to find food and gather food as they go. We're also seeing the Continental Army, and perhaps the British Army too, taking note of what other supplies a farmer or a storekeeper might have on hand that they can impress or take from the farmer or storekeeper for an IOU or not later.
Right. Foraging is generally associated with food, and food for soldiers, food for animals. But in part of the foraging, we have to expand it, and this is really the search for supplies. And so one of the things that the foraging columns are looking for when Washington dispatches these fellows was also horses for the cavalry and harnesses for drawing wagons, you name it. One of the things that I was really fortunate to come across was Henry Lee's account book in Maryland and Delaware, and Hollingsworth, who accompanied him, Henry Hollingsworth, left careful records as to the number of horses that were impressed, the number of hands high that they were. The better horses would be assigned to the light cavalry, to the light dragoons, that is. And so they're going out and looking for all of the stuff of war, not just food, not just feed, but harnesses, leather, saddles, clothing if they need it, weapons if they need them, horses, you name it.
Well, thank you for those clarifying details, because these terms and these actions are going to keep coming up as we dive into the story of Valley Forge. But before we dive into that history, why don't we take a moment to thank our episode sponsor? The Continental Army that survived Valley Forge didn't do it through suffering and virtue alone. As Rick Herrera has shown us, it survived because Washington sent armed columns into the Pennsylvania countryside to seize what the supply system could not deliver: food, horses, clothing, and the will to keep fighting. This kind of history, the history of how real institutions bend and adapt under pressure, is exactly what Ben Franklin's World exists to bring you. As I mentioned at the start, support for this episode comes from the Massachusetts Historical Society, the first historical society founded in the United States in 1791. Our partnership with the MHS helps us bring you more resources and keeps our content freely available. But this partnership is only part of the picture of what keeps this podcast and our newsletters going. The other part is you. For nearly 12 years, Ben Franklin's World has been a community effort. The podcast is possible because listeners like you believe in the work of making rigorous historical scholarship accessible to anyone who has an interest. So if you've been listening to this podcast for a while and it has sparked your curiosity, or it's become part of your routine, I'd love for you to consider supporting us. You can make a tax-deductible donation at benfranklinsworld.com/donate. That's benfranklinsworld.com/donate. Every bit of support helps. Thank you so much for your support and for your consideration. On to Valley Forge. So Rick's book, Feeding Washington's Army, centers on the Continental Army's winter at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania in late 1777 and early 1778. Rick, would you remind us how the Continental Army came to winter at Valley Forge and about the events that pushed the army to encamp there?
The British Army had landed at Head of Elk, Maryland in August of 1777. This is part of Howe's strategy. Find the Continental Army, administer a decisive defeat, take the capital. Not only is this a very physical victory, destruction of the enemy's force, it's also a very important symbolic one, capturing the enemy's capital, chasing the Congress out of Philadelphia. It shows the weakness of the American cause in Howe's mind. Well, Washington will meet them at Couch's Bridge, the only fight that takes place in Delaware during the war. They'll be driven back. They'll continue to skirmish. In September of 1777, both armies meet at Brandywine along Chad's Ford. Washington is defeated, and this is something that Washington sadly was rather used to. Despite the defeat, though, Washington's army held together pretty well. And in fact, during the retirement of the army, Nathaniel Greene really distinguishes himself by using his 2 brigades of Virginians, a division, using them to execute a giant L-shaped ambush on the British Army as it advances southward. And so as the British crest this hill, Green soldiers open fire, and the British are greeted with 75 and 69 caliber balls in the face. That drives them back. Green holds them together. The army retires to Chester. There are other fights at Paoli where Anthony Wayne gets attacked and surprised at night. He's deeply humiliated. The Battle Above the Clouds, which is the battlefield is today at Immaculata College in Pennsylvania. Both armies facing off, and then a downpour. And they just kind of stand there and stare at one another. Our powder's wet. We can't really shoot at each other. Charging up and down a muddy hill with smooth-soled shoes, that's not a good idea. They stare a little bit longer, then both armies just march away. This is a battle that literally fizzles. After that, Washington will attempt a counterattack at Germantown in October. That also goes poorly. Although there'd been some initial success, and in fact, Howe rode out and shamed the light infantry, the elite of the British Army, for shame, light bobs, and leads them into a counterattack. Again, some poor performance by Continental officers, some good performance by some of them. The soldiers, however, acquit themselves pretty well. Finally, we fast forward to December. Washington is still looking for a fight. This guy was an aggressive commander. He draws up the army at White Marsh and begins to fortify it. And this is one thing that the Continental Army was incredibly skilled at, and that's digging field fortifications. So Washington's men fortify this chain of hills, this ridge line that runs from east to west, and he's essentially saying to Howe, come on out, attack me. I really do want you to do it. And Washington's got visions of perhaps another Bunker Hill. Howe marches out. He looks at it. There's some skirmishing off to his left. Howe, too, has visions of Bunker Hill. After all, he had commanded the assaults there. Howe thinks, no, this isn't a good idea. He's got to husband the strength of his army. His soldiers' lives are precious. They're expensive. They march back into Philadelphia, and from there, he will begin to set up his occupation. Washington, though, in the meantime, starts to hold councils of war with his generals, and he sends out the questions ahead of time, has his generals send the responses back in written form, and this is because he wants to control the conversation as much as possible. Not to control what their answers are going to be, rather to make sure that everybody stays focused and doesn't go off on tangents. So his basic question is, should we launch a winter campaign? Now, on the surface, this might sound like madness, because this is an army that's just been defeated at every turn during this campaign for Philadelphia. But if we think about what had taken place the year before, Trenton 1, Trenton 2, Princeton, that's an army that had been defeated, chased out of New York, chased across the Jerseys, and finally into Pennsylvania. Yet it counterattacked and won these 3 stunning victories in the space of about 10 days. Why not now? Washington's got an army that's more seasoned. Its officers are certainly more seasoned. It's not out of the realm of reality. The back and forth with his generals goes on for several weeks. The generals bring up things like continental credit. If we suffer a defeat, what happens to our credit? So they're thinking about finances. They're also thinking about the secondary and even tertiary consequences of victory or defeat. If we win, then what? Well, the British are likely to withdraw to their ships in the Delaware River, and we're left holding Philadelphia. To what end? We haven't defeated the British Army. If we suffer a defeat, then what happens? What happens with morale? What happens to the continental dollar? What happens to our ability to resist the British? All of these things go into the discussions. Finally, Washington does a personal reconnaissance. He observes the strength of the British fortifications in Philadelphia and decides it's not worth it. Then comes the decision, where do we winter? And there are a variety of suggestions that go out. Some recommending Wilmington, Delaware. It's a good place to keep watch. It's close enough to Philadelphia. It's also along the river. The problem is that river gives the British mobility. They command the river because of the Royal Navy squadron that's there. Do we go to Reading or Lancaster? Well, that's too far away, and that essentially surrenders southeastern Pennsylvania to the British. We need to challenge them. Finally, they come upon the Great Valley, and Washington makes a decision. We're going to camp at Valley Forge. And he's also been talking to governors in Pennsylvania. He's been corresponding with the Continental Congress, with Henry Laurens, the president of the Congress, writing also to the governor of New Jersey. What's best? Each governor has his own state to take care of. Washington has got much larger consequences or much larger thoughts that occupy him. Valley Forge is the least bad of all the bad choices that face him. So he selects this, and they march in December, about 12,000 strong.
Could you set the scene for us, Rick? If we've never been to Valley Forge, and none of us have been to Valley Forge during the winter of 1777-78, but would you tell us about the geography of Valley Forge and what made it a good place, or at least the least bad place, for Washington to encamp his army there for winter?
Valley Forge is the encampment, sits on high ground, and that's something that you definitely want in a military encampment. The high ground not only allows you to observe your enemy's approach from a greater distance, very practically, it extends the range of your artillery. Don't ask me to go into the mathematics. I've had one of my students who is a former field artillery battalion commander. He's tried to explain it to me, but like most historians, when it gets into math, my mind just asks, what are you talking about? But I do know enough that the higher the ground, the further you can shoot. So Valley Forge sits atop this. There are also limited roads that enter the encampment, which is great for controlling access and providing security. As far as the trees that are nearby, by the time the army begins to build its huts in December of 1777, those trees are all gone. So if you visit there, and I would urge everyone to visit Valley Forge, get rid of all the trees, take them out of your mind's eye, because these trees have now gone into creating soldiers' huts. They've gone into stabilizing fortifications. They've gone into firewood, you name it. So what this does, besides creating this treeless landscape, is clear the fields of fire for the artillery in case the enemy should approach. So what Washington has done is create something like the fourth largest city in North America. It's actually an armed camp. And I suggest to my readers, in fact, when I talk about the book, I suggest that we think about it as the 18th century equivalent of the modern forward operating base, something that many people are used to hearing about from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So this is an armed, temporary camp from which an army projects force. And so this is what Valley Forge is. It's FOB Valley Forge.
In my mind, I am picturing this very wide area with high ground that has been entirely stripped of trees. And from this high ground, this is where we can see tents, wooden huts that the soldiers built from the trees that they felled, some artillery encampments on the edge of camp. Rick, would we also be able to see any towns or townspeople from our placement at Valley Forge? Would we have been able to see any farms in the surrounding area?
You've certainly got some smaller settlements nearby, towns, villages. You've got outlying farms that are nearby. But for the most part, the army will keep to itself there, send out patrols. Those soldiers will get to visit other farms. They'll meet the local people. There are also outposts that are in different places. So that certainly extends the contact with the population. But Washington has it at probably just the right distance, about 18 miles from Philadelphia. So fairly easy to detect an enemy approach. He's also got patrols that are out. Those make it easier for him to detect an enemy approach. He doesn't want to be too terribly close to the towns because that allows people to spy on him. That allows people to pass information to the British. Although having said that, security was not all that good. There's a German fellow by the name of Kraft who spends about 2 weeks wandering around the camp looking for a commission in the Continental Army. He doesn't get it. Instead, he gets a commission in one of the Hessian regiments.
One of the bad aspects of having trees around your encampment, which, as you said, Rick, is that if you get fired upon by artillery, those trees tend to come down. They crash on you, they splinter into a bazillion different pieces and spray you with shrapnel. Plus, trees are also prone to catching fire, especially from campfires where you have soldiers who might be a little lazy in tending them. But in winter, Trees, even the leafless ones. That is what can provide your army with shelter and insulate it from the elements. And we are talking about the winter of 1777, 1778, which is during the Little Ice Age. So, Rick, what did the absence of trees mean for Washington's encampment and for protecting his army from the elements?
Granted, the trees, as you point out, were absent, but they're not completely absent. They've now gone into making those huts, and so they were providing some form of shelter for the soldiers. And the huts were anything but the uniform, very nice-looking huts that we see today at the national park. Each one varies depending on the quality of work put into it by the soldiers who are living in those huts. So the trees are there in the form of their immediate shelter, but in terms of actually providing anything, not too many around there. And in fact, soldiers would continue to go out further and further from camp in order to search out fuel. And that means looking for trees that are standing.
Now, in his book, Feeding Washington's Army, Rick argues that Valley Forge has taken on a mythic quality in our American memory. And so he teaches us that Americans during the American Revolution really had to overcome a lot of privation and suffering to see the new nation through to its independence. Rick, would you dispel the myth of Valley Forge for us? What really happened during the winter of 1777, 1778? Because I think when we hear Valley Forge, most of our minds think about starving troops, freezing troops, soldiers suffering from disease and supply issues. And from what I've read, if you look at the actual historical record of Valley Forge, it was actually a much easier experience than the really hard winter experience of Jockey Hollow in New Jersey during the winter of 1779, 1780.
Yeah, in fact, while I was doing this work, I was really fortunate to come across a manuscript by Lee Boyle, who is a retired park historian. And Lee did yeoman work compiling the weather data for the entirety of the Philadelphia campaign. So this manuscript, which I hope gets published, it's a great reference. It tells you the temperatures, the rainfall, the snowfall, observations on sunlight, you name it, throughout the entirety of this campaign from when the British depart New York through the Battle of Monmouth. It's a fantastic resource. But you're right. The Valley Forge winter was marked by extremes, and this is something that is part of the Little Ice Age. Climate change doesn't mean that because the Earth is getting colder or warmer, that it's a constant. It means that it's subject to often violent variations. And so what the soldiers encountered at Valley Forge was a freeze-thaw cycle compounded by rain, compounded by snow. Sometimes the snow was deep enough to run sleighs in Philadelphia. Other days, the rivers were overflowing and flooding roads. It just depended on the day, it seemed. Sometimes the mornings are considered quite fine, according to some officers' diaries and journals. So it really depends. The weather fluctuates. And what this really does, though, because of the fluctuation, is turn these roads that were pretty bad to begin with really into mud pits. And so marching along these muddy roads, up to your ankles, sometimes calves in mud, what happens when it freezes? Well, this churned up mud now becomes spiky, frozen dirt, and that helps twist ankles. It makes it difficult going for horses. It plays hell on wagon suspension systems. So it really is a miserable existence because of that. And as you pointed out, Jockey Hollow, the Morristown encampments, those are even worse in terms of the actual temperatures and the snowfall. But misery, I suppose, is contextual. You have to live through it to understand just how miserable it was, even though Valley Forge was not as bad in terms of temperature and snowfall as Morristown.
So in some ways, our memory of Valley Forge is right in that it was a fairly miserable experience where soldiers were getting hurt, they were cold, it was hard to move supplies in and out of camp, and we didn't even talk about disease, and that was also the winter where Washington inoculated his army for smallpox.
Absolutely. You've got a smallpox epidemic sweeping North America. Liz Fenn has written about that in Pax Americana. So Washington sees this, and we've got to get everyone inoculated because sick soldiers, that detracts from the combat strength of the army. I need these soldiers ready to fight. So I've got to keep them healthy. But you're right, it's a miserable winter. When I look at it, though, and I think that when most Americans look at it, we often envision Valley Forge as the worst winter, and that's part of the American myth-making, American memory. For listeners who have seen the Bugs Bunny cartoon, where the ice cream truck rolls into Valley Forge and Continental's heads poke out of snowbanks, I think that's kind of the image that many of us have. And that also goes along with this mythic image of soldiers suffering in silence, when in fact, as the evidence more than amply demonstrates, this was a camp of activity. Despite the miserable weather, soldiers were doing the stuff that modern-day soldiers would recognize today. They're going out and patrolling. They're looking for intelligence on the enemy. They are looking for fights at times. They are also exercising the writ of continental government. They're also there to bolster Pennsylvania's government. So these soldiers, by their simple physical presence, were demonstrating the fact that there was a Continental Congress. There was a form of government for these rebelling colonies, these United States.
Well, we've covered the highlights and the lowlights of the Valley Forge winter, and we actually shouldn't joke about that. There was a lot of suffering during that winter, and we should acknowledge that. But Rick, one event during Valley Forge that you cover in your book, Feeding Washington's Army, that we don't really talk or even hear about is the Grand Forage of February 1778. Would you tell us about the Grand Forage of 1778 and how that event fit into the Valley Forge winter?
The Grand Forge of 1778 is something that was a historian's dream. Nobody had ever looked at it on its own terms. And, how often do we get that chance to find something that's really untouched? Back in the 1920s, there'd been a local antiquarian, Frank Stewart, who'd written a pamphlet highlighting Anthony Wayne's foraging activities in New Jersey and also the subsequent British activities that followed on. And that's used in probably every book that's written about Valley Forge. So looking at that, I thought there's got to be more in this. And so I began to dig much more deeply into it. And this Grand Forge of 1778 was the largest muscle movement of the Continental Army while it was encamped at Valley Forge. And in fact, the British response was the largest muscle movement of the British Army while it was in Philadelphia garrison. And so what this represented was really an act of desperation on Washington's part. He writes that the army is on the verge of dispersal or collapse. From the outset, he realized that holding Valley Forge was imperative. It was not only military necessity, it was political necessity. And politics and warfare cannot be separated. Washington understood this. Although he was, in my estimation, a mediocre tactician, he was becoming a superb strategist. Washington understood the close connection of the army and political regimes. He understood the connection of the army and how it had to subsist and exist at Valley Forge in order to challenge the British for control of this region. So he's between a rock and a hard place. Washington issues orders to Nathaniel Greene. Initially, it was probably going to be Anthony Wayne because he was a local boy, he knew the area. But given the importance of the entire expedition, he goes to his right-hand man. And I know that fans of Hamilton are probably thinking, no, wait, Alexander Hamilton, that's his right-hand man. Well, okay, calm down. It's actually Nathaniel Greene. It's the apostate Quaker from Rhode Island. And Greene is Washington's best field commander. This mission is far too important to leave to a brigadier general in Washington's mind. So it's now going to a 2-star, a major general. He gives Greene orders. Greene doesn't really believe in the expedition, but he's a good soldier. He salutes and says, "Thy will shall be done, boss." And Greene sets out with a vengeance, and he'll march out with somewhere from 1,200 to 1,400 soldiers. And these guys represent some of the best armed, best equipped, and healthiest soldiers in the Army. It's also very much an ad hoc command. So orders go out to the various brigades, collect X number of soldiers for this. Unfortunately, I don't have their names. I would love to come across the muster rolls for this expedition. These soldiers deserve to be known. But they go out, they've got 4 guns, probably 6-pounders, I'm guessing. I haven't found the records recording the calibers. And they will head south into Chester County, looking for these supplies. Greene's fortunate in that Howe did not respond. So he's left unmolested to try and go out and gather supplies. Again, as is the case so often with studying the War for Independence, the records are either not available or are missing. I don't know the exact amount of supplies that he was able to gather, although he did write to his friend Henry Knox at the end of this expedition how proud he was of what he had been able to glean from Pennsylvania's countryside. That leads me to believe that it was not insubstantial. So Greene goes about this. He then decides that he's going to send Anthony Wayne across the river. And this is now Greene taking this expedition and expanding it. Wayne will link up with John Barry, and John Barry is the seagoing equivalent of Anthony Wayne. They're both daring. They're both willing to take a risk. They are both focused on the mission, and the two of them just seem to hit it off well. Barry agrees to ferry Wayne's miniature brigade, all of about 300 soldiers, across the Delaware River to Salem, New Jersey. Then Wayne convinces Barry, I don't think it took much arm twisting, hey, I'd like you to set fire to the marsh hay. And so Barry sets fire to the marsh hay. Why is he doing this? Well, it's not simple amusement. It's to distract the Royal Navy and to help perhaps delay or even prevent a descent of the British Army upon him while he's in New Jersey. So Wayne will work his way through New Jersey. He establishes contact with Colonel Ellis, soon to be Brigadier General Ellis of the New Jersey Militia. Ellis provides him with incredible amounts of intelligence. Wayne is able to send out small parties to go out and contact local farmers, property holders. He even knows how many horses and cattle some of them have. That's how well developed the intel network was for Anthony Wayne. They'll march northward. It's finally, though, with Wayne in New Jersey, that Howe decides to act. And he dispatches the Light Infantry Brigade, the elite of the British Army, to land at Salem and to go after Wayne. In fact, one of Howe's aides-de-camp records that they're there to have a slap at Mr. Wayne. They come within a hair's breadth of capturing him at Swede's Church. Wayne gets away. To his north, though, at present-day Camden, then Cooper's Ferry, another brigade has landed. 2 battalions of the Black Watch, the 42nd Foot, Highlanders, the Queen's American Rangers, probably the crack provincial unit under the command of John Simcoe, who, I hate to tell fans of Turn, was not a homicidal maniac. He was not a psychopath. Sorry. So he's got that, and it seems that Wayne has now got the potential of being captured. He's able to elude it, because what did the British Army do? It fell back on its previous patterns of operation. It began foraging. It began looking for food and supplies that it needed, and it ignored its primary mission of having that slap at Wayne. Here's a chance to administer a defeat to one of the leading generals in the Continental Army, and the British drop the ball. So Wayne is able to get through New Jersey, and he's able to supply quite a bit of cattle, sheep, swine, you name it. As all of this is going on, Captain Henry Lee, who commands 5th Troop 1st Continental Light Dragoons, is doing his foraging in Delaware and Maryland. And he sends back hundreds of head of cattle, sheep, swine, you name it. And so Washington is able to plan at a centralized location, Valley Forge, but then send out trusted subordinates. And so as dramatic as Valley Forge is, and as perhaps, I don't want to say pedestrian, but as uninteresting as feeding an army might sound, this entire expedition, this entire Grand Forage, demonstrates in my mind the maturation of Washington as a commander, but also the maturation of Washington's command team and the trust that existed up and down, but also laterally. This is a pretty sophisticated operation, and Washington has built the command team that can do it. He's also been cognizant of the importance of civil-military relations. Washington recognizes just how important private property is, how it's a foundation for individual political independence, individual economic independence. He understands how important it is to avoid offending people, because this was, after all, a struggle for people's affections, while at the same time getting as many supplies as humanly possible to feed his soldiers. So it's an incredibly complex operation that really shines a light, I believe, on the maturation of the Continental Army's leadership from Washington downward.
That sounds like a really tricky situation where you have to go out and gather supplies for your army, demonstrating that you have the force to take supplies if you need to compel people, but also balancing the need to keep everybody motivated to at least continue their support of the Continental Army and the revolutionaries' cause. Like, you don't want to turn the civilians against the army. So, Rick, when we consider this task, what grade would you give Washington and the Continental Army on the Grand Forage of 1778?
I think overall, I'd have to give the Continentals an A in terms of their ability to make up for what the formal supply system was unable to do for the soldiers. In terms of the Continentals' ability to avoid alienating any more people than it had to alienate. And judging by the results, Washington's soldiers succeeded. So I think they are well deserving of an A. In fact, I think I'm going to give them an A with honors.
High marks. Now, as we think about the Grand Forage of 1778, what were the shorter and longer term impacts of this military operation? So how did having all of these supplies that they were able to gather impact Washington's ability to feed his army at Valley Forge? And what did the success of the Grand Forage mean for Washington's future work to supply and feed his army?
Glad you asked that. The Grand Forage allows the army to survive until the spring. And this isn't to say that there weren't other foraging operations going on, but this is the largest one. The forage allows the army to maintain its position at Valley Forge until spring, until cattle can start coming down from New England. And this means fresh food for the soldiers, which they so badly need. So it's a success in helping the army maintain its position. It's a strategic success. And this, again, is where Washington really shines. It enables the army to keep that position and to prepare for its next engagement. Washington doesn't know what's going to happen. We, of course, know what takes place, and that's the Battle of Monmouth. But because the army is able to maintain its position, feed itself, get resupplied, rebuild its strength with recruits coming in, the army is able to march out and pursue Henry Clinton's retiring column as it's marching toward New York. And Washington's able to have this one last fight in the middle colonies, in the middle states. Clinton also is able to have a fight, which he's looking for before he has to disperse upwards of half his strength to the West Indies. But it's a significant piece and an understudied piece.
We've had a pretty far-ranging conversation today, although we never did stray far from Valley Forge. But this leads me to wonder, what is the one aspect of the winter at Valley Forge in 1777 and 1778 that you wish we better understood? How do you want us to walk away from this conversation remembering the winter at Valley Forge?
The myth that most of us Americans have grown up with, this myth of Valley Forge as a static place, as a place simply of suffering and virtue. I'd like people to understand Valley Forge as a hub of activity. I'd like them to realize that this was the home of an active field army, an 18th century army, but an army doing the stuff that modern armies would today recognize, and to realize that it's more than just this place of suffering and virtue that our myths and our memory have constructed, but it's a hub of military activity, and that Washington is doing many things that modern-day soldiers would understand. And so it's more than what we think it is. It's more than we've grown up to think it is.
We should jump into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. In your opinion, Rick, what might have happened if George Washington had never ordered the Grand Forage of February 1778? How do you think the Continental Army's encampment at Valley Forge would have ended differently? And how might the American War for Independence have ended differently?
Oh boy. Had Washington not ordered the Grand Forage, the army would have faced two choices: dispersal or destruction. Washington, I believe, would have probably retired further west, somewhere toward Lancaster, somewhere toward Reading, falling back on his bases of supply. By doing so, that would have undercut all pretensions to Continental Congress's authority in southeastern Pennsylvania. It would have given the British free range within that area. That said, I think that the war would have still continued. The revolution was too far gone by 1777, 1778. Britain's presence and ability to gain more loyalists was not going anywhere very quickly. It might have dragged the war out a little bit longer, but I think that the conclusion might very well have been the same. It would have just taken longer. Washington would have had a more difficult time recruiting troops, I suspect. His army would have survived, but he would have really undercut, as I said, any pretensions to continental authority in Pennsylvania. It would have weakened the Continental Congress's hand at saying that, hey, we are the government of this place.
As a military historian who has just covered the logistics of the Grand Forage, what aspect of military history are you researching and writing about now?
I'm editing a collection of letters. This is something that I came across in grad school in 1997, and it's a collection of letters from a private in the Regiment of Mounted Riflemen, today's 3rd Cavalry Regiment, who enlisted in 1846, lands at Veracruz during the Mexican War, fights his way to Mexico City, comes back. He left a collection of 13 letters, very long, and they're wonderful letters. They're at the New York Public Library, and I promised myself long ago that I would edit them for publication. I'm finally getting around to it today. In fact, I owe the University Press of Kansas the manuscript in June. So let's hope that I can finish it on time. So I'm turning that in. That'll be one of my excursions into the 19th century, but I'm planning on returning to the American War for Independence in a couple of years by re-examining the 1778 and 79 campaigns for Savannah, which is really something that needs to be looked at again. It's been far too long.
Now, if we have more questions about the winter at Valley Forge and the Grand Forage, how can we pose them to you?
You can find me with a simple Google search, either Rick Herrera or Ricardo, academia.edu, as well as Google Scholar.
Ricardo Herrera, thank you for helping us investigate the winter of 1777, 1778, and for telling us about the Grand Forage of 1778, which I don't think is an event that many of us had heard before our conversation.
Hey, it's been my pleasure, and I'm glad that very few people have heard of it. That means you have to go out and read about it. That means you've got to buy my book.
And where can we buy your book, Rick?
Go to UNC Press. You can get it through Amazon as well. Ask your local booksellers to carry it, because, by golly, they should be carrying it.
Thank you, Rick.
Thank you, Liz. It was a blast.
Rick's account of Valley Forge helps us see the facts of Valley Forge through all the myth we learned in school about how the winter of 1777, 1778 was a picture of frozen suffering, virtue, and little else. As Rick related, the soldiers at Valley Forge were not idle. The army was not simply enduring. Valley Forge was instead a hub of military activities, and what happened there really shaped the trajectory of the war. Now, as Rick made clear, the Continental Army was never the polished, well-supplied force that Washington needed. Instead, as Rick put it, it was something of a pickup team. Soldiers from radically different regions who couldn't understand each other's accents, sustained by a supply system that Congress had deliberately fragmented, and all of that nearly broke the army entirely. And yet, through foraging, impressment, strategic ingenuity, and the relentless energy of commanders like Nathaniel Greene and Anthony Wayne, the army endured Valley Forge and marched out in the spring ready to fight again. And for the 1778 campaign season, the army was actually more professional because not only was it now battle-tested, but it had been drilled by Baron von Steuben at Valley Forge. So the army that went out of Valley Forge in the spring of 1778 was not the same army that went into winter quarters there in the winter of 1777. The Continental Army's transformation at Valley Forge is the thread that connects this conversation to our panel discussion next week. In episode 442, we'll explore the rhythms of everyday life in the British and Continental armies and in militia units. We'll see how profoundly the conditions of war shaped the men who fought it. Plus, we'll also explore what the soldiers ate, who gave them orders, and what kept them from simply walking home anytime they were bored or uncomfortable. So Valley Forge was a great place for us to start, but we have so much more to explore next week. You'll find more information about Rick, his book, Feeding Washington's Army, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/348. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts, so if you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Joseph Edelman, Karen Wolf, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Clio Digital Media, and support for this episode comes from the Massachusetts Historical Society, the first historical society founded in the United States in 1791.